45 times history was edited to protect the rich. That isn't just a tightlights, the reality hidden in plain sight. The wealthy didn't just control armies or empires, they controlled the story itself. They buried massacres under monuments, turned thieves into saints, and rewrote crimes into legends. What you thought was history was often nothing more than a script polished to glorify the powerful. In this video, this horrendous mask will come off. Chapter 1. Pharaohs who claim divinity to hide slave labor. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt declared themselves gods on earth, not kings, not men, gods. This was the ultimate manufactured myth of wealth and illusion, so powerful that to question a pharaoh was to defy the heavens themselves. But behind the temples and golden tombs lay the truth: empires built on backs bent in slavery. The pyramids weren't miracles of divine will, they were monuments of sweat, blood, and broken bodies. Generations of laborers were worked to death, their names erased so completely that the stones themselves seemed to rise from nothing. Yet the myth endured. Why? Because divinity erased accountability. If the ruler was divine, then oppression became destiny, and rebellion became blasphemy. The rich had found their perfect shield, not armies, not weapons, but lies carved into eternity. Every hieroglyph was propaganda, ensuring that the poor remained forgotten while the pharaoh remained eternal. But Rome would take this trick even further, turning massacres into masterpieces of glory. Chapter 2. Caesar's fabricated triumphs. Julius Caesar wasn't just a general, he was his own publicist. Every battle, every march, every victory was carefully scripted in his commentaries on the Gallic Wars. These weren't reports, they were advertisements. To Rome he painted himself as a flawless conqueror, destined by fate to lead. But buried beneath that polished narrative was a nightmare of slaughter. Entire tribes were wiped out, villages burned, women and children enslaved. He didn't just win battles, he committed massacres and called it glory. The rich elite of Rome applauded him because Caesar's myth secured their empire's image of strength. And the common people? They had no voice against a story written by the man who wielded the sword. His lies became the foundation of his power, the stepping stones to dictatorship, and ultimately, immortality. Caesar understood a terrifying truth: history doesn't belong to the victors, it belongs to the editors. But if Caesar wrote his triumphs in blood, the Medici would paint theirs into immortality. Chapter 3. The Medici Illusion. The Medici family weren't just bankers, they were survivors in a world where money painted targets on your back. Florence whispered about their corruption, their ruthless loans, their manipulation of popes and princes. So how did they bury the stench of scandal? With beauty. They turned their blood money into marble, fresco, and symphonies. They financed Michelangelo, Botticelli, and Brunelleschi, rewriting themselves as the guardians of art, not predators of the poor. It was the perfect illusion. Every painting, every cathedral dome was less about devotion and more about damage control. The Medici didn't just buy art, they bought immortality. By branding themselves as patrons of culture, they disguised the truth. They held power not through inspiration but through financial chains that strangled Florence. Their wealth wasn't sacred. It was manufactured myth, scrubbed clean by genius brushstrokes. The people marveled at the art, while forgetting who paid for it and why. But if the Medici bought beauty, colonial empires bought morality, disguising genocide as civilization. Chapter 4. Colonial Civilizers. When European empires carved up the globe, they wrapped their knives in silk. They told the world they weren't invaders but saviors, bringing civilization, progress, and faith to the uncivilized. It was the greatest branding campaign in history. But behind the polished speeches and missionary banners was nothing but plunder, lands stolen, cultures erased, and millions enslaved under the myth of destiny. The colonizers wrote the textbooks. They painted themselves as heroes, building railways and schools, while hiding the fact that those same railways shipped stolen goods and starved nations. They called it discovery, as if people hadn't lived there for centuries. They called it order, as if genocide were charity. And when the blood dried, they built museums filled with treasures ripped from conquered hands. The myth of civilization wasn't progress, it was a mask. A mask so convincing that even centuries later, some still believe it. And when starvation threatened to expose the truth, corporations like the East India Company rewrote famine into fate. Chapter 5. The East India Company's vanishing famine in 1770, Bengal starved. 10 million people perished in one of the deadliest famines in history, yet when the reports reached London, the story was rewritten. The East India Company, the richest corporation of its age, blamed the skies, claiming drought and misfortune. But the truth was darker. There was no shortage of grain. Shipments were exported for profit while entire villages wasted away. The rich ate, the poor were erased. The famine was not an act of nature, it was an act of greed. But in Britain, newspapers echoed the company's polished excuses. Politicians bowed to the same men who funded their campaigns. The victims had no voice, no memory, except to serve as a footnote. To protect their wealth, the company didn't just erase people, they erased accountability itself. History was edited into tragedy instead of crime, ensuring shareholders kept their dividends clean of blood. But starvation wasn't the only truth. Hidden industrial kings in the West polished their brutality into myths of generosity. Chapter 6. The Myth of Athenian Democracy. Athens is remembered as the birthplace of democracy, a shining beacon of freedom in the ancient world. But the myth was crafted for the rich, not the people. The celebrated democracy excluded women, slaves, and foreigners, most of the population. Only wealthy male citizens could vote, ensuring power remained concentrated in the same elite hands. This wasn't democracy. It was oligarchy wrapped in poetry. Philosophers and playwrights immortalized Athens as a cradle of reason and equality, but the truth was a society built on slavery. While a handful debated justice in marble forums, tens of thousands labored unseen in quarries and workshops. The myth worked. For centuries, Athens became synonymous with liberty, while its brutal inequalities vanished from memory. The powerful rewrote reality so well that even today, the word democracy owes its prestige to their illusion. But if Athens cloaked oppression in philosophy, Rome perfected the art of distraction, turning tyranny into entertainment. Chapter 7. Bread and Circuses. Roman emperors faced a problem. How do you rule when the poor are starving and angry? The solution was as brilliant as it was sinister. Bread and circuses, grain distributions, and gladiator games were framed as generosity, a gift from emperors to their loyal people. In reality, it was a mask. The bread wasn't charity, it was hush money. The circuses weren't entertainment, they were anesthesia. While the elite tightened their grip on power, the masses were distracted with bloodsport and scraps of food. The myth of Rome as a benevolent empire thrived, while corruption and brutality were scrubbed from the spotlight. The formula worked for centuries. As long as the people were fed and entertained, they would forget their chains. Rome rewrote oppression into spectacle, rewriting tyranny into tradition. It wasn't governance, it was manipulation immortalized as glory. But if Rome bought silence with games, the Church bought obedience with something even stronger: the claim that kings ruled by divine right. Chapter 8. Kings by divine right. When crowns grew heavy with suspicion, the Church offered monarchs the ultimate shield: divine right. Kings weren't just rulers, were God's chosen. Questioning them wasn't treason, it was blasphemy. This myth sanctified corruption, wrapped tyranny in holiness, and silenced rebellion with scripture. The truth was brutal. Monarchs bankrupted nations through war and vanity projects, while peasants starved under impossible taxes. Yet sermons echoed through cathedrals, declaring poverty to be God's will and obedience a sacred duty. A king's cruelty became destiny, his greed became providence. The myth made sure the poor never stood a chance. The fight wasn't just against armies but against heaven itself. For centuries, crowns gleamed not because they were earned, but because they were sanctified. A golden halo, manufactured by priests, shielded kings from justice. But divine crowns weren't enough. The knights beneath them forged their own myths of honor, hiding a world built on oppression. Chapter 9. The myth of chivalry. Knights are remembered as noble warriors, bound by honor and loyalty. But this romantic image was a weapon of propaganda. In reality, knights were enforcers of a brutal system that kept peasants crushed under feudal chains. Chivalry wasn't about justice. It was a mask. Behind the poetry of gallant defenders was a world of burned villages, stolen harvests, and women treated as spoils of war. The code of honor preached restraint, but only toward other elites. The poor had no protection. The myths of ballads and epics painted knights as guardians of virtue, while their swords enforced inequality. The rich cloaked brutality in armor and poetry, ensuring that generations remembered steel as honor instead of terror. Even today, the word chivalry carries nobility, not the screams of those who paid its price. And if knights rewrote themselves as protectors, crusaders took it further, branding looting and conquest as holy war. Chapter 10. The Crusades as Holy War. The Crusades were marketed as wars of faith, divine missions to liberate holy lands. Pope after pope promised salvation, forgiveness, eternal glory. But the battlefield was less about heaven and more about gold, land, and power. The rich saw opportunity. The poor were sent to die. Armies swept across Europe and the Middle East under banners of the cross, yet villages were plundered, treasuries looted, and enemies slaughtered in God's name. Chronicles erased greed, focusing instead on divine triumphs. What was theft became piety. What was murder became holy duty. The myth was so powerful that centuries of carnage were remembered not as crimes but as sacred history. The Crusades weren't holy, they were branding. They gave the rich new land, new wealth, and eternal immunity from blame. And for the Church, they cemented a monopoly on both faith and fear. But while crusaders painted greed as holiness, conquistadors would frame their massacres as discovery. Chapter 11. Conquistadors as explorers. When Spanish conquistadors set sail, they branded themselves as fearless explorers. Columbus, Cortes, Pizarro, they were sold as visionaries discovering new worlds. But discovery was a lie. These lands were already filled with thriving civilizations. What followed wasn't exploration, it was extermination. The conquistadors torched empires, toppled kings, and enslaved entire nations. Yet history books reframed the slaughter as progress. Gold stolen from temples filled European treasuries, while priests declared it God's plan. Massacres were renamed conquests, and greed was polished into destiny. The myth of discovery turned butchers into legends. Statues still stand, celebrating men who left only blood and ash. By rewriting genocide as bravery, the rich secured eternal glory for themselves, while silencing millions who lost their homes, their cultures, and their lives. But conquest wasn't the only tool. When women resisted power, a new myth was forged: the witch. Chapter 12. Witch hunts to protect property. For centuries, Europe erupted in waves of witch hunts. Officially, they were said to protect society from dark magic. In reality, they protected property and power. Women who challenged authority, widows who owned land, or healers who defied church control were branded witches. Trials were staged spectacles. Neighbors testified, inquisitors condemned, and flames consumed. The myth of witches transformed political and economic theft into holy duty. Families were ruined, wealth was seized, and the church tightened its grip. What should have been remembered as organized theft was immortalized as moral purification. The rich found their perfect excuse. Every accusation erased another obstacle. Every execution rewrote power in their favor. Centuries later, the myth of witches still lingers as folklore, while the true motive greed remains buried beneath ashes. But while witches burned in Europe, ships carried a far darker myth across the Atlantic: the slave trade as commerce. Chapter 13: The Atlantic Slave Trade Sanitized as Commerce. The transatlantic slave trade was humanity's greatest theft, millions ripped from their homes, chained, branded, and shipped like cargo. Yet merchants, kings, and bankers polished the atrocity into commerce. It was listed in ledgers, wrapped in contracts, and protected by law. The rich sold the story as trade, no different than sugar or tobacco. They rewrote human lives into profit margins. Ships, packed tighter than coffins, became symbols of progress, not nightmares of suffocation and death. Europe's great wealth was born on these chains, yet history books often soften it into economics. What should have been remembered as centuries of genocide was reframed as business. Even monuments built from slave wealth erased their true foundations, glowing instead as symbols of prosperity. The slave trade wasn't commerce, it was catastrophe hidden behind ink and coin. And this myth of commerce soon evolved into an even greater illusion: colonization as civilization. Chapter 14: Colonization as Civilization. When Europe colonized Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they told the world they were bringing light into darkness. Colonization was rebranded as the civilizing mission. Missionaries wrote tales of savages saved, governments claimed to spread progress, and maps redrew entire continents in imperial colors. The truth was theft, pure and brutal: resources stripped, cultures destroyed, languages erased. But by wrapping conquest in morality, empires silenced critics and justified centuries of oppression. The railroads they built weren't gifts, they were pipelines for stolen wealth. The schools weren't enlightenment, they were factories for obedience. The myth of civilization didn't just protect the rich, it gave them halos. Generations were taught to see invaders as heroes and enslavers as teachers. Colonization wasn't civilization, it was organized looting dressed up as destiny. But when colonizers faced famine and starvation, they turned to a new kind of rewriting the corporate cover-up of catastrophe. Chapter 15: The East India Company and the famine cover-up. In the late 18th century, India starved under the East India Company's rule. Entire provinces withered, villages turned to dust, millions died in the Bengal famine alone. But the official reports told a different story. The famine, they claimed, was unavoidable. Blame the monsoon, blame the soil, blame fate. The truth? Grain wasn't scarce, it was exported under guard to feed Britain's markets. While children wasted away, warehouses brimmed with food marked for profit. The famine was engineered, not natural. But by rewriting the cause, the company washed its hands in ink instead of blood. The British elite swallowed the narrative, protecting shareholders while millions vanished from history. Famine was remembered as tragedy, never crime, a lie so powerful it erased not only the victims, but the perpetrators too. But famine wasn't the only truth. Polished clinkings themselves mastered the art of branding tyranny as divine brilliance. Chapter 16: Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis XIV turned himself into a brand. He wasn't just king, was the sun, the center of France, the life force of a nation. Versailles gleamed like heaven on earth, a palace meant to blind his people into worship. But the sun's light came from fire fueled by debt. While nobles danced in golden halls, peasants paid with hunger and taxes so crushing they bordered on slavery. The myth of the Sun King erased the truth. His wars bankrupted France, his vanity drained treasuries, and his glittering reign planted seeds of revolution. Yet history remembers his shine, not his shadows. The illusion of divine brilliance protected his legacy long after the starving had been buried. But while monarchs hid behind halos, aristocrats perfected their own lie-pretending nobility, while their peasants withered in mud. Chapter 17: The Noble Aristocrat Myth. The European aristocracy lived like gods while peasants tilled the fields. To justify their privilege, they manufactured the myth of nobility, that they were guardians of tradition, protectors of the weak, and symbols of grace. Poetry, portraits, and ceremony immortalized them as the natural order of society. But the truth was parasitic. While peasants starved through harsh winters, nobles gorged on banquets, taxes climbed while wages never rose. The supposed protectors of the people were the very thieves who stole their bread. Yet chroniclers in noble service rewrote the hunger into tales of loyalty and harmony. The myth of noble grace allowed inequality to survive for centuries. Even as resentment boiled, history books polished aristocrats into paragons of elegance. They weren't protectors, they were predators wrapped in silk. But while nobles polished their image, the Dutch sold their own myth, a golden age that glimmered on stolen lives. Chapter 18: The Dutch Golden Age. The Dutch Golden Age is remembered as a time of prosperity, science, and breathtaking art. Paintings of canals, ships, and merchants depict a nation of progress and culture. But the golden sheen was soaked in blood. Dutch wealth flowed from slavery, piracy, and colonial domination. The East and West India companies trafficked humans by the hundreds of thousands. Profits from sugar, coffee, and spices funded paintings that glorified calm domestic life. What looked like prosperity was plunder, erased in brushstrokes of serenity. Museums still hang these masterpieces as treasures of civilization, rarely acknowledging the chains that paid for them. The myth of a golden age hid the brutality of empire. Dutch prosperity wasn't born in trade. Alone it was carved into the backs of the enslaved. The art was real, but the innocence was fake. And as merchants posed as visionaries, pirates faced a rewrite of their own villains for the poor but heroes for the rich. Chapter 19: Pirates versus Privateers. History remembers pirates as lawless villains, marauders of the seas. But the truth was written by the elites who controlled the waves. While common pirates were demonized as criminals, elite-backed raider-scald privateers were celebrated as patriots. The only difference was paperwork. Pirates and privateers both robbed ships, plundered cargo, and left corpses in their wake. But when the queen or a king signed the license, bloodshed became honor. The poor pirate swung from the gallows, the privateer was knighted, immortalized in ballads, and rewarded with titles. History books erased the double standard, polishing theft into glory, as long as the loot flowed upward. The myth of privateers as heroes rewrote piracy into patriotism. It was the same crime but branded for profit. The oceans didn't belong to courage or justice. They belonged to those who could afford to rewrite the rules. And if pirates were recast as villains, America's founding fathers were recast as saints of liberty while holding chains of their own. Chapter 20: The Founding Fathers' Myth of Liberty. America was built on the promise of liberty, freedom, and equality. The Founding Fathers enshrined those ideals in declarations and constitutions. But behind the stirring words was a contradiction too massive to ignore. Many of these men owned slaves. The architects of freedom denied it to the very people who made their wealth possible. Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal while he kept men, women, and children in bondage. Washington fought for independence, while his plantation thrived on forced labor. Yet history books painted them as untarnished heroes, erasing the chains and focusing only on speeches. The myth of liberty was polished until the hypocrisy vanished. The result was a nation founded on a lie: freedom for some, silence for others. The fathers didn't free all men, they edited history so they'd never be remembered as tyrants. But the rewriting didn't stop with nations. The industrial age would create a new breed of liars. The robber barons turned into captains of industry. Chapter 21: Robber Barons. As captains of industry in the late 19th century, America's industrial giants were called robber barons. They crushed unions, bribed politicians, and built monopolies that strangled competition. Yet history remembers them with a softer name, captains of industry. This wasn't a correction, it was a cover-up. Through philanthropy, carefully crafted biographies, and monuments, men like Vanderbilt, Morgan, and Carnegie reinvented themselves. They weren't exploiters, they were visionaries. Their ruthlessness was rewritten as ambition, their greed as progress. Newspapers, owned by the wealthy, helped polish their image until the public forgot the workers they had ground to dust. The myth turned villains into architects of the American dream. And it worked. Generations grew up believing these men lifted a nation, when in reality they bent it to their will. But no one mastered this rewriting better than John D. Rockefeller, who painted oil wars as acts of charity. Chapter 22. Rockefeller's Oil Wars as Philanthropy. John D. Rockefeller built Standard Oil into an empire that dominated America. To do it, he crushed rivals, manipulated railroads, and sparked wars for control of pipelines. Competitors called him ruthless, the public saw him as a tyrant, but Rockefeller refused to be remembered as a villain. He poured millions into philanthropy, building universities, libraries, and foundations. The press began to shift. Instead of a monopolist, Rockefeller became the man who gave back. The myth of the generous titan overshadowed the fact that his fortune was made on broken companies and ruined lives. History remembers his donations, not his destruction. His name is tied to charity, not monopoly. The blood spilled in the oil fields was erased by the glow of philanthropy. Rockefeller didn't just rewrite his story, he bought it, but Rockefeller wasn't alone. Carnegie followed a similar script, donating libraries to erase the screams of his striking workers. Chapter 23. Carnegie's Libraries versus his strikes. Andrew Carnegie gifted libraries across America, branding himself as a patron of knowledge. Generations learned to see him as a man who lifted society through learning. But this shining image concealed a far darker reality. Carnegie's steel empire was built on brutal working conditions, poverty wages, and merciless hours. When workers demanded dignity at Homestead, Carnegie's managers unleashed armed guards, and the river ran red with blood. Strikers were shot, beaten, and starved into submission. Yet the massacre was scrubbed from memory, while the libraries stood as glittering monuments to Carnegie's supposed generosity. The myth of philanthropy triumphed. Children read in free libraries, never realizing those books were bought with the lives of their parents and grandparents. Carnegie wasn't just a giver, he was an editor of his own sins. But while Carnegie polished his image, Britain perfected its own rewrite, turning child labor into a moral duty. Chapter 24. Britain's child labor. Rebranded as discipline, factories of industrial Britain were filled with children, some as young as 5. They worked in mines, mills, and foundries, faces black with soot, hands blistered by machines. To the wealthy industrialists, this wasn't exploitation, it was discipline. Reformers tried to expose the horror, but factory owners pushed a different narrative. Children were being taught responsibility, learning the value of work. Pamphlets, speeches, even schools claimed that child labor built character, but in truth, it built fortunes. Their tiny hands repaired machines adults could not. Their bodies were cheaper to feed, their voices too small to resist. The myth of discipline masked the reality of exploitation. Generations of children lost their childhood so that factory owners could amass dynasties of wealth, and history books often softened the story, framing it as a necessary step in progress. But if child labor was rewritten as discipline, monopolies were rewritten as progress, and railroad tycoons led the charge. Chapter 25. Railroad tycoons and the myth of progress. The great railroad tycoons branded themselves as pioneers who stitched America together. Newspapers hailed them as men of vision, bringing prosperity with every mile of track. But beneath the myth of progress lay monopolies, corruption, and violence. Tycoons bribed lawmakers, stole land, and cheated workers out of wages. They crushed strikes with hired guns. And when entire towns resisted, they simply bought the sheriffs. Yet the public rarely heard these stories. The press, owned or influenced by railroad money, called them nation builders. Textbooks praised their railroads as the iron veins of progress, not the chains of exploitation. The myth worked so well that statues rose for men who would be criminals today. Progress wasn't shared, it was hoarded, polished into legend, while the poor paid the price. But America wasn't the only place rewriting greed. In Africa, Cecil Rhodes manufactured his own myth, an empire builder cloaked as a visionary. Chapter 26. Cecil Rhodes. Visionary mask. Cecil Rhodes sold himself as a dreamer. He spoke of building nations, spreading civilization, and forging destiny across Africa. But his speeches were camouflage. Behind the mask of vision lay naked greed. Rhodes carved up land, stripped it of diamonds, and enslaved its people under brutal systems of forced labor. Entire villages were uprooted, starved, and broken to serve his empire. Yet statues rose in his honor. Scholarships carried his name. Textbooks painted him as a bold pioneer who imagined a united future. It was propaganda on a monumental scale, turning one of history's most ruthless exploiters into a prophet of progress. The myth of Rhodes wasn't built on genius, it was built on blood. His legacy wasn't destiny, it was theft, whitewashed into eternity. But Rhodes' empire didn't end with minus, it bled into war, rewritten as patriotism instead of plunder. Chapter 27. The Boer Wars rewritten. The Boer Wars were not noble struggles, they were resource wars. Britain fought in South Africa not for settlers, but for gold and diamonds buried in the earth. Yet London spun a different tale. Newspapers declared it a fight for patriotism, a battle to defend civilization and protect innocence. On the ground, women and children were starved in concentration camps, farms were burned, towns erased. But the propaganda machine drowned out the truth. In Parliament, leaders praised sacrifice and valor. The press glorified British soldiers while silencing the fact that it was empire's greed that pulled the trigger. The wars were theft disguised as duty, conquest wrapped in flags. Generations grew up believing in noble defense, never seeing the graves behind the glory. And when the killing ended, the spoils weren't buried, they were placed in museums, polished into heritage. Chapter 28. Museums of plunder. Walk through the grand halls of Europe's museums, and you'll see treasures that dazzle the eye: sarcophagi, jewels, statues, sacred relics. Labels describe them as preserved heritage. But these halls aren't temples of knowledge. They are vaults of theft. Colonial empires looted palaces, temples, and graves, shipping artifacts across oceans. What was sacred became spectacle. Generations of school children admired these objects as gifts to civilization, never told of the soldiers who killed to obtain them, or the cultures erased to fill those glass cases. Preservation was the lie, plunder was the truth. Museums became propaganda machines, teaching the world that theft was education, that conquest was enlightenment. Theft had been rewritten as generosity. But no museum lie was darker than Leopold II's Congo genocide, hidden behind the mask of philanthropy. Chapter 29. Leopold's philanthropy hoax. King Leopold II of Belgium branded himself a humanitarian. He told the world he brought civilization to the Congo, founding charities and parading as a benevolent ruler. But behind the speeches lay a reign of terror. Villages burned, men mutilated, children orphaned. Millions died so Leopold could profit from rubber. Yet the king's propaganda machine churned endlessly. Pamphlets praised his generosity, paintings immortalized his supposed benevolence, and diplomats toasted his charity. The reality, the Congo was a private death camp, was buried beneath lies. The philanthropy hoax worked. For years Europe believed Leopold was a savior, not a butcher. By the time the truth clawed its way out, millions had already vanished into silence. But while Leopold hid behind charity, America's elites built marble palaces that rewrote exploitation as nobility. Chapter 30. Gilded Age Mansions. In America's Gilded Age, colossal mansions rose like cathedrals of wealth. They were branded as monuments to progress, symbols of a new aristocracy born from ingenuity. The rich portrayed themselves as noble builders of civilization, their palaces proof of earned greatness. But the chandeliers and marble masks hid the truth. These fortunes were built on child labor, crushed unions, monopolies, and wage slavery. Behind every ballroom lay a factory where men lost fingers, women collapsed from exhaustion, and children worked until they broke. History books celebrated elegance. Newspapers praised achievement. But nobility was manufactured, it wasn't inherited or earned. The gilded palaces were not monuments to progress. They were tombs for the exploited, rewritten as landmarks of greatness. And soon an even greater rewrite would follow war itself, polished into glory and remembered as sacrifice. Chapter 31. World War is Noble Lie. World War I was branded as the war to end all wars. Leaders promised sacrifice would bring eternal peace, honor, and a safer world. Posters showed smiling soldiers, flags waved in the streets, and young men enlisted believing they were fighting for civilization. But this was a carefully crafted myth. In truth, it was slaughter for profit and empire. Arms manufacturers grew obscenely rich, bankers secured fortunes, and political elites redrew maps in their favor. Workers, the poor, and farmers became cannon fodder in mud-soaked trenches. Gas-choked lungs, rats crawled across corpses, and entire generations were erased. Yet the official story softened it into noble sacrifice. It wasn't about peace, it was about power. The myth endured, dragging millions more to their deaths in a war remembered for its glory, not its greed. But when the guns fell silent, another rewrite began this time. On Wall Street, where greed was hidden by blaming the poor. Chapter 32. Blaming the Great Depression on the poor. The Great Depression shattered economies worldwide, yet history's first rewrite wasn't about the bankers who caused it. Instead, the blame shifted downward to ordinary people. Borrowers were labeled reckless, farmers were branded failures, and the unemployed were shamed as lazy. The truth was systemic. Wall Street had gambled fortunes on speculation, inflated bubbles, and reckless credit. When the crash came, the elites shielded themselves, while millions were thrown into soup lines. Newspapers painted poverty as weakness, not as the result of corruption. Politicians lectured the hungry about morality, while bankers quietly bailed themselves out. The myth worked. Generations came to see the Depression as the failure of individuals, not the crime of institutions. The rich erased their guilt, and the poor carried the blame. But while Americans were taught shame, Germany was taught something else entirely. Industry cloaked itself in nationalism to rewrite its own crimes. Chapter 33. Nazi Industry Partnerships. Hidden Nazi Germany wasn't powered by ideology alone, it was powered by corporations. BMW, Siemens, Krupp, and IG Farben thrived on slave labor and war contracts. They didn't resist Hitler, they fueled him. Factories churned with forced labor, profits soared, and companies tied themselves to genocide. But when the war ended, a new story was told. Many corporations branded themselves as reluctant participants, victims of Nazi coercion. Logos were redesigned, histories scrubbed, reputations reborn. The Nuremberg trials punished a few executives, but most returned quietly to business, rebuilding their fortunes. The truth was buried. History books focused on nationalism, ideology, and leaders, while the profiteers disappeared into footnotes. Wealth survived, guilt evaporated. The myth of national unity concealed the fact that corporations were co-authors of atrocity. And while Germany rewrote its industries, Japan polished its empire, masking conquest as liberation under the banner of Asian unity. Chapter 34. Japan's Asian Unity Myth. Japan's empire spread across Asia under the slogan of liberation. They called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, promising to free Asian nations from Western colonialism. Textbooks described it as destiny, propaganda posters showed brotherhood, and soldiers swore they were building unity. But in truth, it was conquest. Armies looted cities, enslaved workers, and stripped colonies of resources. Villages starved as rice and grain were stolen for the empire. Factories were filled with forced laborers who were beaten and broken. Yet the myth persisted. Japan claimed to be savior, not oppressor. Even after defeat, fragments of this illusion lingered. Nationalist histories softened the cruelty, teaching pride instead of shame. Unity was never the goal, domination was. Liberation was a mask, and across the ocean, America was preparing its own myth-casting capitalism as freedom itself during the Cold War. Chapter 35. The Cold War Freedom Myth. The Cold War wasn't just a battle of weapons, it was a battle of myths. America branded capitalism as absolute freedom and communism as absolute tyranny. Every injustice, every inequality, every strike or protest was buried under this narrative. Corporations exploited workers while posing as patriots defending liberty. Politicians silenced dissenters by painting them as traitors. Propaganda framed exploitation as democracy and greed as the price of freedom. Millions bought the illusion, never realizing that the rich were using patriotism as armor. It wasn't freedom, it was fear polished into propaganda. The myth kept corporations safe, kept the powerful untouchable, and silenced those who questioned. The Cold War's real winners weren't nations, they were the elites who used ideology to shield their fortunes. But when fear alone wasn't enough, coups were staged across the globe and rewritten as noble defenses of democracy. Chapter 36. Coups. As democracy defense in the mid-20th century, the CIA toppled governments from Iran to Chile. Each coup was branded as protection of democracy, a noble stand against communism. But the myth was cover for something far less noble: oil, copper, and corporate profits. In Iran, a democratically elected leader who dared to nationalize oil was erased, replaced by a dictator who bowed to Western interests. In Chile, Salvador Allende, chosen by his people, was overthrown and replaced with military terror. Newspapers back home called these operations liberation. Speeches framed them as defense of freedom. The reality was iron fists, secret prisons, and entire populations chained by dictatorships that served U.S. business. The myth of democracy defense wasn't about liberty. It was about empire disguised as protection. But America didn't just export coups, it exported a dream, a glittering lie called the American dream. Chapter 37. The Myth of the American Dream. The American dream became the nation's most powerful export. Movies, speeches, and classrooms promised anyone could rise with hard work. It was a story crafted to inspire loyalty, to convince the poor that success was only one job away. But the dream was designed to protect the rich. Generations worked multiple jobs, yet wealth flowed upward. Systemic barriers, redlining, segregation, gender discrimination ensured opportunity was limited to a chosen few. Those who fell behind were told it was their fault, not the system's. Poverty was recast as laziness, inequality reframed as motivation. The myth silenced protest. It kept millions struggling in silence, believing failure was personal. Meanwhile, the elite lived off their labor, shielded by the illusion of fairness. The dream wasn't freedom, it was propaganda, marketing inequality as opportunity. And soon, corporations used propaganda not just to silence the poor, but to hide the destruction of the planet itself. Chapter 38. Polluters. As innovators' factories belched smoke, rivers ran black with chemicals, and cities choked in smog. Yet industries that poisoned the earth branded themselves innovators. They paid for glossy ads showing happy families, green lawns, and promises of progress. Their myth was genius, Destruction disguised as modernity. The truth was toxic. Waste poisoned drinking water, cancer clusters formed near factories, and air became lethal. But history remembered the ads, not the damage. Politicians, funded by corporations, repeated the lie of innovation, ensuring that the companies responsible for devastation were praised as pioneers. What looked like progress was simply poison polished into opportunity. Generations suffered, while industries were celebrated. Innovation wasn't progress, it was propaganda with a deadly price tag. And no industry perfected this sleight of hand more than big tobacco. Chapter 39. The Tobacco Lie. Tobacco companies mastered the art of rewriting reality. For decades they claimed smoking was safe, even healthy. Doctors appeared in ads endorsing cigarettes, studies were buried, and millions believed the lie. Smoking wasn't poison, it was style, relaxation, even medicine. But behind the marketing, death spread like wildfire, cancer rates skyrocketed, lungs blackened, yet profits soared. Executives counted billions while denying the obvious truth. When evidence mounted too high to ignore, they pivoted, portraying themselves as honest businesses seeking solutions. They recast their crimes as mistakes, their manipulation as misunderstanding. The myth was so powerful it outlived generations, killing millions before accountability arrived. Tobacco didn't just rewrite history, it rewrote death itself, polishing a slow-motion massacre into lifestyle. And soon, another empire borrowed their playbook, Big Oil, shifting blame for global destruction onto individuals through a myth called the carbon footprint. Chapter 40. The Carbon Footprint Hoax. By the late 20th century, oil giants faced undeniable evidence of climate catastrophe. Rising seas, dying forests, collapsing ecosystems, all traced back to fossil fuels. Instead of admitting guilt, they launched a brilliant lie: the carbon footprint. Suddenly, the crisis wasn't about corporations, it was about you. Turn off your lights, recycle your bottles, drive less. The narrative shifted responsibility from billion-dollar polluters to everyday people. While the public argued over plastic straws, oil executives expanded drilling and banked record profits. The myth privatized guilt and globalized profit. It was one of the most effective rewrites in history. The greatest environmental crime reframed as personal lifestyle choice. Corporations were cast as innovators, while individuals were shamed into silence. The truth? Climate collapse wasn't caused by your light bulb. It was caused by empires of oil rewriting reality. And when the next collapse came in 2008, the rich rewrote history again, this time blaming homeowners instead of bankers. Chapter 41. Wall Street's 2008 rewrite. In 2008, the global economy collapsed. Banks gambled recklessly, sold toxic assets, and lied about risk. When it all imploded, millions lost homes, jobs, and savings. Yet history quickly shifted blame not onto Wall Street, but onto homeowners. The story became one of irresponsible borrowers, not predatory bankers. Executives testified in polished suits, claiming the system was sound, that mistakes came from the bottom, not the top. Bailouts flowed upward, while foreclosures crushed ordinary families. The real criminals walked free, rewarded with bonuses. Meanwhile, textbooks softened the crash as a financial crisis caused by market forces. The greatest heist of modern times wasn't punished, it was reframed. But Wall Street wasn't alone. A new class of mythmakers was rising from Silicon Valley. Chapter 42. Tech giants as disruptors. Silicon Valley sold itself as the future visionaries, rewriting the rules, creating freedom and innovation. Disruption became their myth, but behind the glossy keynotes and sleek devices lay sweatshops, data exploitation, and monopolies every bit as ruthless as the old barons. Tech CEOs branded themselves as saviors, men in hoodies changing the world. But workers were underpaid, privacy was stripped, and wealth ballooned at the very top. Their carefully crafted image turned billionaires into prophets. Reality, they were landlords of the digital age, charging rent on every click. The myth of disruption wasn't liberation. It was feudalism with Wi-Fi. And while tech giants hid exploitation, pharmaceutical empires rewrote greed as innovation. Chapter 43. Pharmaceutical greed as innovation. Drug monopolies branded themselves as pioneers of science, champions of health, but what they sold as innovation was often manipulation. Life-saving medicines were priced so high patients were left to die. Research funded by public money was patented for private profit. Executives wrapped themselves in white coats and noble slogans, but their actions were ruthless, suppressing generics, lobbying against reforms, and bankrupting families desperate for treatment. The myth of medical progress silenced outrage, making exploitation look like discovery. They didn't just sell medicine, they sold the illusion that profit was healing. And while medicine polished itself in labs, luxury brands created their own myths in silk and gold. Chapter 44. Luxury brands and manufactured nobility. Luxury houses tell a story of elegance, rarity, and timeless beauty. They market handbags and jewels as noble symbols, reserved for the elite. But the scarcity is manufactured products deliberately destroyed to inflate value, workers underpaid to maintain illusion. The myth of nobility convinces the world that wealth is culture, that owning fabric or diamonds makes one superior. Behind the glittering shop windows lies exploitation no less brutal than a mine or factory floor. Luxury wasn't nobility, it was a trick, convincing people to worship objects as if they carried divine bloodlines. But the greatest rewrite was yet to come when billionaires recast tax evasion as generosity. Chapter 45. Billionaires as philanthropists. The modern billionaire perfected the oldest lie, turning theft into sainthood. They dodge taxes, exploit loopholes, and hoard fortunes that could end hunger 10 times over. Yet through charity foundations and press campaigns, they are painted as humanity's saviors. Schools bear their names, hospitals carry their logos, and articles celebrate their gifts. But these gifts are crumbs compared to the mountains they hoard. Philanthropy isn't sacrifice, it's image control. It erases the injustice that made them rich and cements their power as untouchable. The poor are told to be grateful, while the rich are immortalized as benevolent gods. In truth, charity became the final rewrite of the mask, hiding a global empire of inequality. Final payoff. Across centuries, the rich have not only hoarded wealth, they have hoarded memory. They rewrote wars into triumphs, slavery into commerce, and famine into fate. They bought artists, priests, newspapers, and politicians to polish their sins into virtue, and every time the truth threatened to surface, they buried it beneath another myth. But myths don't last forever. Statues crack, lies unravel, and what remains is the trail of blood behind the gold. History wasn't edited to protect humanity, it was edited to protect profit. The powerful didn't just shape the past. They shackled the present. The greatest trick the rich ever pulled was convincing the world to worship them as heroes. But behind the masks, the crowns, and the foundations, they were always the same, thieves rewriting the story so their crimes looked like destiny. And now, the edits stand exposed.